4 men descended into a coal mine 200 meters below ground in West Virginia. None of them returned. Rescuers found only their helmets, crushed as if by someone's enormous hand. The bodies disappeared without a trace. The official version was a gas leak and a cave-in. But there was no collapse. The sensors recorded nothing, and there were traces left on the clay in the side tunnel. Human in shape, but not in finger size. This is the story of what happened in the Marrow Deep Mine that night, and why the locals still don't talk about it openly. Mercer County in West Virginia is a coal region. Small towns are scattered among hills covered with dense forest. Here, every third family is connected in one way or another with coal mining. The Marrow Deep Mine had been operating since the mid-1970s. It was a medium-sized enterprise with about 100 people on staff working 3 shifts. The depth of the workings reached 350 meters. Nothing extraordinary, just a typical coal mine with typical problems. Methane, humidity, periodic roof subsidence. But there were no serious accidents. The night shift began at 23 on February 7th. 4 men were assigned to descend into the lower tunnel in section D3 to check the drainage system. Water was accumulating faster than usual, and management wanted to find out the reason before the scheduled repairs began. It was a routine task. Descend, inspect the pumps, check the pipes, ascend. An hour's work at most. Richard Carroll was the foreman. 41 years old, 20 years of experience in the mine, an experienced, calm man. His colleagues recalled that Richard was never in a hurry and always followed instructions. Thomas King worked with him as a pair, 37 years old, an electrician by trade. Lewis Doyle and Mark Hunt were younger, both around 30. Doyle was a mechanic, Hunt was a laborer, but he was already gaining experience. The 4 descended into the cages at 23:30. The dispatcher on duty at the surface recorded the time. Radio communication was working normally. Carroll reported their arrival at the level. Then the group moved toward section D3. The tunnel was dry, the lighting was working. Nothing unusual. At 12:10 a.m., Carroll got in touch and reported that they had reached the pumping station. The water was indeed coming in faster than the sensors showed. He said they would inspect the pipeline further along, possibly for a leak or blockage. The dispatcher confirmed. The connection was lost. At 12:50 a.m., there was still no contact with the team. The dispatcher tried to get in touch, but there was no response. Only a slight crackling of interference could be heard from the radio. He waited another 10 minutes, then reported to the shift supervisor. The supervisor decided to send the rescue team on duty. 3 men descended into the mine at 1:20 a.m. They took extra lighting, medical supplies, and spare radios with them. It took about 15 minutes to descend to section D3. The tunnel was fine. There were no collapses, no signs of smoke or gas. The sensors showed normal levels of methane and carbon dioxide. They moved slowly, shining their flashlights in all directions, but found nothing suspicious. At a depth of about 200 meters from the entrance to section D3, they came across the first traces of the missing men. Tools lay on the floor, wrenches, hammers, a flashlight. One of the flashlights was still on, its beam directed toward the wall. An open bag of spare parts stood nearby. But there were no people. Further on, about 10 meters away, they found 3 helmets. They lay on the ground, scattered within a radius of several meters from each other. When one of the rescuers picked up the first helmet, he immediately noticed a dent. The metal body was deformed on the side, concave inward. It wasn't cracked or broken. It was dented, as if something heavy and wide had hit it. The second helmet had a similar deformation, but even more pronounced. The third was crushed almost beyond recognition. The metal bent so much that it formed a deep depression. There were no traces of rock on the helmets, no scratches or dust that would indicate falling rocks, just smooth, clean dents. One of the rescuers would later say that when he held the helmet in his hands, it seemed to him that the dent repeated the shape of fingers. Wide, splayed fingers that had squeezed the metal like a tin can. The fourth helmet was not there. The rescuers continued their search. A few meters further down the tunnel, they noticed a narrow passage in the side wall, one of the old drifts that had been closed in the 1980s when the area was deemed unprofitable. Usually such passages were bricked up or simply marked with a sign, but there was no sign here. The entrance was open. The beam of one of the flashlights lay on the floor, directly opposite this passage. It was as if someone had placed the flashlight there on purpose to illuminate the direction, or dropped it while looking there. One of the rescuers approached and shone his light inside. The passage was low, just over a meter high. The walls were damp, and there was a musty, sour smell that was difficult to describe. But it wasn't methane. The sensor showed normal levels. They decided not to go in right away. They returned to the surface and reported their discovery. By morning, they had assembled an expanded team of 8 people, including an engineer and the head of security. They took more lights, ropes, and measuring instruments. They descended at 8 a.m. on February 8th. The first thing they did was check the main tunnel again. They looked for signs of a struggle, blood damage, nothing. The ground beneath their feet was solid, dirty in places from moisture, but with no obvious signs of a fight or resistance. The tools lay as if they had simply been put down, not thrown down in a panic, deliberately placed. That was strange. People who run away or try to escape don't put their tools down neatly. Then they examined the side passage. It was dark and damp inside. The ceiling was crumbling in places, but not critically. The floor was covered with clay, soft and pliable, and it was on this clay that they found the traces. The traces began about 5 meters from the entrance. The first ones were blurred and smudged, but further on, they became clearer. They were prints similar to human feet, about 25 centimeters long, maybe a little more. But the shape was not quite right. The heel was narrow, the toes long and splayed. There were indentations in the clay from something sharp, like claws or nails, but too pronounced for a normal human being. The engineer took several photographs. The pictures turned out blurry. 90s technology, film cameras, poor lighting. But the prints were visible. The group moved on. The passage stretched for about 40 yards, gradually narrowing. The air became increasingly stifling. One of the workers later said that it seemed to him as if they were descending, although the slope was insignificant, perhaps only a few degrees, but the feeling of descent was there. The tracks continued. There were more of them. In one place, the group found several footprints running parallel, as if several creatures were walking side by side, or one creature was moving in an unusual way. It was impossible to say for sure. The ceiling was getting lower. They already had to walk bent over. Some sections of the tunnel were so narrow that they had to squeeze through one at a time. The safety officer suggested stopping. It was dangerous to continue, as the old workings could collapse at any moment, but one of the workers noticed something ahead. A fourth helmet lay on the floor. It was further away than the other finds, almost at the very end of the passage. It was lying on its side, with the visor turned toward the wall. When they picked it up, it was clear that it was deformed in the same way as the previous 3. But there was something else on this helmet. There were dark spots on the inside surface, on the lining. They were later examined. Blood. The blood type matched one of the missing persons, Mark Hunt, but Hunt himself was not there. Neither were the other 3. The passage ended in a dead end, a wall of rock and old concrete masonry, the remains of a ceiling installed when the site was closed. No cracks, no passages, a dead end, But the tracks led right here and ended at the wall. The group returned upstairs around noon. They reported their findings. Management called in specialists, mountain rescuers, geologists, a representative of the mining inspectorate. By evening, a commission had arrived at the mine. An official investigation began. Everyone who was on shift that night was questioned. The dispatcher, colleagues, superiors. They checked the logs, radio communications, sensor readings. Everything was normal. No gas emissions, no signs of a collapse. Communication was interrupted suddenly, for no apparent reason. The helmets were sent for examination. Experts determined that the deformation was caused by enormous pressure. The compressive force exceeded 500 kilograms per square centimeter. Such pressure cannot be created by human hands, not even a very strong person. It requires a mechanical press or hydraulic equipment, but there was no equipment in that tunnel, only lamps and hand tools. One of the dents had a special shape, rounded, with 5 distinct indentations arranged in a semicircle. The expert who conducted the investigation wrote in his conclusion, "The configuration of the damage resembles the imprint of an enlarged 5-toed limb. However, this assumption has no rational explanation in the context of the known circumstances of the incident." The search continued for another week. The mine was completely surveyed, all accessible areas, all tunnels and workings. Dogs were used, but the animals behaved strangely. In section D3, they refused to enter a side passage. They whined and backed away, despite the commands of their handlers. One of the dogs became so tense that it vomited right at the entrance to the old tunnel. Nothing else was found. No bodies, no traces of blood, except for stains on a helmet. No belongings belonging to the missing men. It was as if the 4 men had vanished into thin air, leaving only their helmets and tools behind. The families demanded answers. Richard Carroll's wife insisted that the mine be blown up and the entire section be searched meter by meter, but this was technically impossible and economically impractical. Management offered compensation to the relatives and promised a thorough investigation, but the investigation reached a dead end. By the end of February, the search was officially called off. Section D3 was closed. The side tunnel was sealed with concrete, this time according to all the rules, with reinforcement and seals. The work was carried out urgently, with the team working in 2 shifts. One of the bricklayers later recounted that when they were pouring the last layer of concrete, a sound came from deep within the tunnel, a dull, low sound, as if someone had struck a heavy object against a stone, but they did not check. They poured the concrete and left. The mine continued to operate. Life gradually returned to normal. But there was talk among the workers. The old-timers recalled stories told by their fathers and grandfathers about strange sounds in deep mines, about knocking in the rock where no one could be, about finds that did not fit into logic. They talked about the underground dwellers. That's what they were called in Appalachia. Short creatures living in caves and abandoned mines. Tommyknockers. That's what the German miners who came to America in the 19th century called them. The Commission's official report was released at the end of March 1991. The conclusion stated that the incident was caused by an unexpected gas release combined with a local rock collapse. The bodies were not found due to complete blockage and the inability to access the site. The families were paid compensation. The case was closed, but the report itself contained some oddities. Attached to the main document was a technical note that most people did not even read. It stated that methane and carbon dioxide sensors did not record any exceedances of normal levels before, during, or after the incident. No debris was found in either the main tunnel or the side tunnel. The nature of the deformation of the helmets does not correspond to mechanical damage from falling rock or impact with a tool. The note stated, "The pressure applied to the protective helmets exceeds the physical capabilities of human hands and requires the use of mechanical equipment with a lifting capacity of at least 500 kilograms. The presence of such equipment in the specified sector has not been confirmed. One of the commission members, a geologist with 20 years of experience, asked to have his name removed from the final list. He refused to sign the conclusion. Later, in a private conversation, he told a colleague that the marks on the clay in the side tunnel could not have been left by humans or animals of any known species. The anatomy of the foot did not match any registered footprint. He suggested bringing in an anthropologist, but management rejected the proposal. The Marrow Deep Mine operated for another 3 years. In 1994, the enterprise closed for economic reasons, falling demand for coal, cheap imports, and reduced production. The equipment was dismantled and the mine shafts were partially flooded. Section D3 remained underwater. But before the closure, there were several more incidents that were hardly ever mentioned publicly. In July 1991, 5 months after the disappearance of 4 workers, the night shift at another section heard noises. These were not ordinary noises, not the creaking of metal, not the crumbling of rock, not the work of machinery. The workers described the sound as a rhythmic knocking, slow, dull, coming from somewhere below, from the depths. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more knocks, as if someone were hitting a rock with a heavy object. The foreman reported it to the dispatcher. The dispatcher checked all sectors. Everything was quiet. No work was being done at that time. The sound repeated twice more during the shift, then stopped. The bosses explained it away as seismic activity, even though there are practically no earthquakes in the Mercer area. In October of the same year, an electrician performing routine maintenance on a neighboring section discovered marks on the wall of one of the tunnels. The scratches were deep, parallel, running along the concrete facing about a meter above the floor. They stretched for several meters, then stopped. The scratches were fresh. The concrete in the damaged areas remained white, not yet darkened by dust and moisture. The electrician showed his discovery to the site manager. The manager ordered the scratches to be filled with cement mortar and not to mention it again. The workers said among themselves that the scratches looked as if someone had run their claws along the wall. 4 parallel lines, evenly spaced. In January 1992, an incident occurred that finally undermined the morale of the team. 2 workers, James Cole and Eddie Preston, stayed behind after their shift to finish welding work on one of the sections. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning. They worked in relative silence, only the hum of ventilation and the occasional sound of dripping water. Preston later recounted that at first they heard footsteps, heavy, slow footsteps coming from somewhere deep in the tunnel from the closed section D3. The sound was getting closer. Cole turned off the welding machine, and they both listened. The footsteps continued, steady, rhythmic. But between the footsteps, there was something else. A scraping sound, as if someone were dragging something heavy across the ground. Preston took the flashlight and shone it into the darkness of the tunnel. Nothing could be seen beyond 30 meters, only blackness and damp walls. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell. They stood motionless, straining to see into the darkness. About a minute passed. Then a sound came from the darkness, low, guttural, like heavy breathing, or a wheeze. Not human. Cole and Preston didn't wait. They grabbed their tools and went up to the surface. Cole quit the next day. Preston worked for another 2 months, then left too. Both moved to other states and never worked in mines again. The management of the Marrow Deep Mine tried to hush up such incidents. They didn't want any publicity. The company's reputation had already suffered after the February incident. Contracts with customers were hanging by a thread. any rumors about strange occurrences could spell the end of the business. So all complaints and reports from workers ended up on the safety manager's desk and went no further, but rumors spread quickly among the local population. The relatives of the deceased did not believe the official version. Thomas King's mother regularly came to the closed entrance to the mine and demanded the return of her son's body. She was seen there, even in winter in the snow, standing at the gate with a homemade poster. The poster read, "Bring my son back. He did not die from gas." Richard Carroll's wife tried to organize an independent investigation. She found a lawyer willing to take up the case and contacted a local newspaper. The article was published in April 1992. It was a short article on page 3 titled "Miners' Families Demand Case Review." The article mentioned inconsistencies in the Commission's report and the family's request to continue the search. But the article did not cause much of a stir. A week later, the lawyer dropped the case, citing his busy schedule. It later emerged that the lawyer had been pressured. He received a call from the office of the company that owned the mine, hinting that further action could damage his career. In a small town where everyone knows each other, such threats are effective. The lawyer did not want to take any risks. The case was closed for good, but some information still leaked out. One of the rescuers who participated in the search in February 1991 gave an interview to a local radio station years later. This was in 2005, when the mine had long since closed and most of the participants in the events had moved away. His name was not mentioned, and his voice was altered by software. He talked about the traces on the clay, the strange behavior of the dogs, the helmets, and the dents in them. He also mentioned a detail that was not in any official document. When they entered the side tunnel for the second time, already fully equipped, one of the group members noticed the wall at the very end of the passage. There, on the damp surface of the stone, was something resembling a drawing or scratches, uneven lines that formed something like symbols. He photographed the find, but the film later disappeared from the archive. When he tried to reconstruct the image from memory, he drew something resembling primitive pictogram, angular figures resembling people with elongated limbs. This information remained unverified, but it aroused interest among researchers of paranormal phenomena. Several groups tried to enter the territory of the former mine, but all the entrances were flooded or blocked. Access is impossible without special permission and equipment for underwater work. No one was willing to invest money in such an expedition. In 2008, the land where the Marrow Deep Mine was located was purchased by a private company. They planned to build a warehouse complex. Excavation work began. Workers stumbled upon one of the old ventilation shafts, which was not marked on modern maps. The shaft had partially collapsed, forming a funnel with a diameter of about 5 meters. When engineers descended to assess the scale of the problem, they discovered that the funnel led to one of the side tunnels. The old mine was 2/3 flooded. The water was murky, cold, and smelled bad. They shone their flashlights down and saw some objects at the bottom under the water. They were metal structures, possibly the remains of equipment. One of the workers suggested going down to check, but the foreman said no. It was too dangerous. The old tunnels could collapse at any moment. The funnel was concreted over and covered with earth. Construction continued. The warehouse complex was built a year later, but some workers at the site complained of strange noises, especially during the night shift when the area was deserted. There were dull thuds coming from somewhere below, as if something was moving under the concrete. The guards heard scratching sounds near the walls of the warehouse. One of them quit after seeing a shadow at night, a human-like silhouette crouching down and quickly running from one building to another. He claimed that the silhouette was moving strangely, not like a person running, but sideways, bent over. Management explained it away as vagrants or animals. Lighting was increased on the premises, and additional cameras were installed, but the sounds did not stop. By 2010, interest in the events of 1991 had almost faded. The families of the victims had come to terms with their loss, even though they had not received any real answers. Richard Carroll, Thomas King, Lewis Doyle, and Mark Hunt are listed as having died in industrial accidents.